Hello, I'm Huw Jones.
I'm Yasmin Faghihi.
And today we're going to talk to you about data provenance and digital manuscript description. And we're going to talk to you about it in the context of one particular data set, which we've been working with, which is Faghihi.
Faghihi is a union catalogue of manuscripts from the Islamic world. It started in 2009. It's been going since. It's a work in progress consisting of data from about 23 repositories, manuscript descriptions mainly, some fragments, and the data in itself is very non-homogeneous, as various institutions are contributing at different levels, sometimes with the manuscript in hand, sometimes from legacy data, and with different priorities. So the data is visible through Faghihi, but the TI is held in GitHub and can be downloaded. It's freely accessible. And about 2 years ago, we had a small data cleanup project, which was extremely necessary due to the hybridity of the data. And at the moment, we are engaging with a project that looks into provenance.
And I think that that's provenance of the manuscripts rather than provenance of the data. I think there's a couple of things about Faghihi, one of which is it's been going for a very long time and has all kinds of data from all kinds of different people in it. And our new project, which is going to use linked data to generate new information from the catalogue, is really kind of reliant on knowing where that data comes from. So when you're dealing with a data set which has data from a variety of sources, all the way through from 18th, 19th century catalogues to people working now, when you're dealing with that programmatically, it becomes much more, data provenance becomes much more important. We thought we'd just take a quick look at some of the types of data in Faghihi, just to show you the kind of variety of data which is in there. And I'm just going to come out and go into a browser so we can look at Faghihi itself. We'll start with
So here we have an example of a very extensive description of a manuscript which contains a lot of detail. We can see here a lot of detail on the physical description and the history of the manuscript and on provenance of the manuscript. We have focused in the first place, we focused on data that can be indexed and standardized. So name data that is harmonized with authority files, transliteration standards, and so on. And here you can see an example of a record which is very basic and was one of the first records that we worked on, which contains only this clear selection of data, which was important for creating really the core of the database, whereas the more descriptive data is still held in its legacy form in the printed catalogues and linked to that way.
So we have a kind of an enormous variety of data created from different sources at different times in Faghihi. I suppose when we think about uses of the data, again, where the data comes from kind of comes more and more into focus when we think about different use cases for the data. So one of the use cases for the data is, of course, interacting through the catalog interface, which we'll show you in a moment. The other use of the data is as a data set itself. So for analysis, for visualization, and for those kind of more digital humanities activities, and we'll go on to that in a minute. But we'll start with the interface itself and just show you how the data kind of maps together, I suppose, when you use it through the catalog interface.
Yeah, so I demonstrate a search here on a term divan. Divan is a term used for a collection of manuscripts of poetry in Arabic and Persian and Ottoman Turkish. And so it is, before we did that data cleanup, we had like hundreds of entries that contained divan or had divan as a title. And after the disambiguation and the data cleanup, we created unique identifiers for titles that belonged, for example, to a specific author. So here you can see, by doing this search, we can look at all the works identified as such by this author, Hafiz, a famous Persian poet, and it groups together, it links up all entries from all institutions that have contributed their data to Faghihi. And likewise, we can do a linking up of names of records under this name and other works by the same author.
And then if you were to go into one of those works, you'd then see the full description of the catalogue record, and then by clicking on some of those links, in essence, the interface allows you to, it has a kind of internal sense of the map of the data, and it allows you to jump between authors, works, titles, manuscripts in a way that seems to be quite seamless, but actually is kind of reliant on all of these data dependencies and mappings which are inherent in the data. And if I just show you now a different visualization of that data set, which is a visualization of co-occurrence of titles in the data set, so titles which commonly occur in the same manuscript. Again, this is interesting in that, in a sense, here is the data, the whole map of Faghihi, but divorced from a sense of its sources. So it creates this map, and it's quite a large map. And as we zoom out, you can see the whole of Faghihi with all of its complexities coming into focus. But in order to, and these associations are kind of mapped in the data, but without a sense of the data's provenance, or without a good grasp of the data's provenance, it becomes increasingly difficult to rely on visualizations of this type. So these as we move into these more complicated, complex areas, data provenance comes more and more into focus for us. And we'll just skip ahead and start talking about our new project, which, if anything, brings it even more into focus. Oops, sorry.
Yeah, so we're looking into provenance of the manuscript's origin, as well as provenance of the data. Provenance of the data is important, as I said, this is a work in progress, and there is information constantly added to, and new data created, even within a single record. And that is important to record, but also the provenance of the manuscripts themselves is extremely ambiguous. And so we are trying to extrapolate provenance information based on other data, like physical descriptions or other elements of the description, and group them together with evidential provenance that we have from other manuscripts.
And I think that essentially what we're doing is trying to cluster together, use linked data to cluster together manuscripts which share features, and then I suppose the rules of the game that we're playing is that if in that cluster you have one manuscript or a couple of manuscripts which have firm provenance, i.e. we know where they were produced and where, can you then extrapolate out within that cluster of manuscripts sharing, for instance, material, binding, script, and say that, and create a hypothesis that those other manuscripts also share the same provenance. I think it's worthwhile drawing the distinction that we're not making assertions about these manuscripts. We're not replacing the idea of somebody actually dating or placing a manuscript. We're creating hypotheses which then could be tested by people actually looking at the manuscripts. But I think that as we as we come to rely on existing data, so data in the catalogue, to generate new data, the provenance of that data, if anything, becomes even more important. So we're using TEI as our data model, as many others do. And TEI does have mechanisms for recording data provenance. So we use the source description, which describes the sources from which the original record was derived, be it a catalogue entry or inspection of the manuscript. And then we have revision description, which describes all the changes which have been made to that record over time after the initial creation of the record. And then we have, for much more fine-grained, I suppose, provenance, data provenance, rather than provenance of the manuscript, but provenance of the data itself. We have change and cert, which are attributes or features which allow you to, in a very fine-grained way, say which change relates to which description, and also certainty allows you to say how certain you are of the validity of that change. So if you're talking about dating a manuscript, are you very certain that this is the correct date, or are you a bit certain or not very certain at all?
And these are also the exactly the same elements and attributes that allow us to feed the data derived from our experiment hypothetical data back into the data set.
And I'll just show you quickly a TEI record, which uses some of these functions. So here's the TEI record from First, and you can see that in the source description, it says that the manuscript description is based on E.G. Browne, etc. So it has the sense of where the manuscript description comes from. And then in the change bit, you have the changes which have been made to that record, who made them, and sometimes, if it's an automated procedure, a link to the script. Now, what we're thinking of doing is with our new project, is going beyond that and actually recording changes. And this is not a real change. This is something just put in for the purposes of this demonstration. But here it says a hypothesis on dating this manuscript has been generated by X methodology, or a link here to a piece of code. And if you can actually give that change an ID, and then up where the information is actually in the record, so on orig date, so the date of the manuscript, you can say that this orig date has been generated by that methodology. So you're essentially saying that a human didn't date this, a computer dated it, and it used this particular methodology to do it. I'll just go back to the presentation. And obviously this raises a number of issues.
Yeah, so it's important to record data provenance, especially as more computational work is done to it, because it's a different type of evidence. And there are a variety of types of evidences. And in order to make any sense when we look at the data in bulk, it's very important to be able to refer back to where it came from.
And especially, I think, as we generate new data from existing data using computational work, I think one of the bigger issues that comes up is then how do we deal with the networks of dependency which exist when, for instance, inferring a date for a manuscript from another manuscript. Those kind of data dependencies and mappings which are there in the interface and in visualizations become incredibly important when you're actually making new assertions about data based on existing data. You need to know where that data comes from. But I suppose the converse argument is, if we map every single bit of data in the TEI record back to the methodology which generated it, are we creating a kind of impossible map of dependencies in our data set, which could never be maintained and has kind of uncontrollable cascading effects of data through our data set, and potentially with linked data to other data sets?
Yeah, so the possible answer to that would be that we can never do without the actual human interference and knowledge about traditions of manuscripts and experience with working with manuscripts.
So on that note, I suppose our conclusion is that manuscript experts are still important. Okay, thank you for listening, and that's it.